Hey everyone, welcome to week 6, and we are making a turn in the course at this point because we have finished the first half of the course, obviously, the first 5 weeks. We've also finished the narratives of the New Testament, the four Gospels, and the book of Acts, and so we are now turning towards the letters that fill the rest of the New Testament. Of course, the Apocalypse, the last book, which we'll get to in week 10. I hope that the order in which we are studying the New Testament will help you read the letters better, but also maybe uh, suggest to you that the order of the New Testament itself is not irrelevant to its interpretation. Often our understanding of Paul's letters in particular, but the other epistles, has sort of traded in a kind of historically empty Jesus, you might say, or not a very well developed story of Jesus kind of working for us as we dive into all of this language from Paul about the death and resurrection of Jesus, which is, of course, the uh, centerpiece of his gospel. But if you read that language without the preceding books kind of shaping your imagination, you can begin to develop an understanding of the Christian faith, of the gospel, that doesn't really need the life that Jesus lived, doesn't really need the circumstances that led to his death. Uh, and the resulting interpretation of the letters, and of Paul in particular, I think is very poor. So I hope that as we start studying Paul's letters this week, that your imagination as the reader of those letters, as the interpreter of those letters, will be duly kind of formed by the recent study of the Gospels about Jesus, and then the book of Acts that tells the story of how, by the power of the Spirit, the gospel about Jesus' resurrection began to transform the Jewish community in Jerusalem, especially that of Jesus' disciples, but spilling out into the society around, and then, of course, spreading from there throughout Judea and Samaria towards the ends of the earth. And the kinds of struggles that were part of the book of Acts that kind of made it the drama that it was should inform the way we read Paul's letters. So, quite clearly in the book of Acts, there is a variety of challenges that go with the crossing of social differences of uh, different types, whether crossing the boundaries, as it were, between Jews based in the land of Israel and Jews coming from the diaspora as pilgrims for the Feast of Pentecost. Uh, then crossing a kind of boundary between Aramaic speaking uh, Jews and Greek speaking Jews in Acts chapter 6. And then, of course, perhaps the most pronounced boundary for many of us, the one between Jews and Gentiles. So the idea of social difference, and an intricate kind of social difference that isn't easily reducible to categories but is thick with all kinds of history and sensibility, that really needs to be front and center for us as we make sense of Paul's gospel and try to follow the arguments of his letters. You're going to get a sort of brief introduction to Paul, along with the treatment of his little letter to Philemon in the presentation that goes with response form 1 for this week. But if I can anticipate that a little bit and say something that I didn't emphasize probably enough in that introduction and preparing it, is that Paul's letters come from someone who is a preacher, someone who is a rhetorician, and consequently, the language of Paul's letters is dynamic. It is a sort of performance, as it were. And often our reading of Paul has sort of imagined that instead of these dynamic sermons, as it were, that are kind of technical but full of rhetorical flourishes and sometimes irony and even sarcasm, we've somehow imagined that they are kind of monotone theological treatises that deal with various theological topics. And so our interpretation of them often turns into a general idea, what Paul is actually using to address something very specific. And so that's part of the challenge that we have before us starting this week, is tracking the arguments of Paul, not just in terms of the reasoning, but also in terms of the rhetoric, sort of the dynamic way in which it is speaking to an audience that is dealing with concrete difficulties that are either named or otherwise exhibited in the letter itself. So I hope that you will come at these letters with an eye for that kind of subtlety, and maybe even an ear for that sort of rhetorical art that characterizes Paul's writing, and I think has been systematically underappreciated, if not neglected altogether, in the Christian reception of Paul's letters, so that we have turned into sort of timeless general truths, words that Paul is addressing to something very particular, so that what it implies for us and for situations other than that addressed by the letter is an open question. And it certainly is relevant as part of Scripture, but what it means for us is something we have to determine by virtue of studying carefully what Paul's argument is delivering in the context of its letter. So, that is going to be, I think, a hermeneutical challenge for all of us, and a lot of our study over the next several weeks is going to be focused on trying to slow our reading down as we kind of thread through Paul's arguments and attempt to piece together what he's saying, but with a view to clarifying, why is he saying what he's saying? To what purpose is he arguing what he's arguing? He doesn't have aimless letters that simply want to make some random general statements about Jesus. He is always addressing particular concerns known to the audience, and so that means that his kind of strings of argument have a rhetorical purpose that we have to try to discern and then use to interpret what he is saying. So I'm looking forward to our discussion in the forums. I expect that there will be lots of questions about the way that I am trying to frame Paul, the framework I'm trying to give, because I do want to challenge what has become a kind of standard framework for interpreting the Apostle Paul's letters in the evangelical tradition, maybe the Protestant tradition more broadly, but especially evangelicalism in the modern West. We have a certain sense of what Paul is about that I think, to be frank, is just mostly wrong. And there's a lot of good interpretation of Paul as well in certain contexts of the evangelical tradition, but I want to try to use this introduction to Paul to give you what I hope is a stimulating challenge to how Paul has been received in your own Christian community and tradition, and to subject that to the scrutiny of careful study of the letters themselves. And that's really what it comes down to. Not one person's framework over another, but what the letters themselves say as we study them. So I look forward to the conversation about that, and we will be focusing our attention this week on two letters of Paul's, as I mentioned, Philemon and also the letter to the Philippians. And part of my reason for beginning there, you'll hear some clarification of in the introduction to Paul. So, have a good week, and we will be in touch in the forums.